Good evening. Whoa. Good evening. Hello. My name is Andrew Hansen. I'm the program director at Guroian CSF. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 18th annual Paul Homer Lecture. For 18 years now, Guroian CSF has hosted this annual lecture named in honor of Dr. Paul L. Homer. Dr. Homer was a professor of philosophy and philosophical theology at the University of Minnesota and later at Yale. A devout Christian, Dr. Homer in many ways embodied what has become the distinctive mission of Guroian CSF, strengthening Christian intellectual life in the Twin Cities and beyond by bridging church and university. Dr. Homer was a distinguished academic, a scholar who was known internationally as an interpreter of Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein. He was also deeply committed to the church. Alongside his teaching at Yale, he routinely preached and taught Sunday school. When he traveled for his academic work, he would often contact area churches, offering to serve them by preaching in their Sunday morning services. Guroian CSF seeks to cultivate this kind of twin commitment to church and university in the Twin Cities. We see our function as analogous to a bridge. On the one end, we want to bring theological resources from the church to bear on the intellectual work that's going on in the university. And on the other end, we want to engage the academic resources of the university for the well-being and the mission of the church. Our Homer Lecture is one venue for this work. Each year we bring a nationally known Christian scholar, usually in the humanities or in theology, to the University of Minnesota to speak on a topic that is of special importance for the church and university. Tonight's topic has relevance for all of us, whether we're parents or educators or simply lovers of stories. Scholarship in recent decades on the importance of narrative has confirmed to us that stories aren't just for kids, but they're actually a foundational part of how we view the world. But they are still especially important for kids. Tonight's lecture will help us think carefully about why and how stories matter, informing us into people who can distinguish right from wrong, and more importantly, desire what is right and what is good. But before we get started with the lecture, I want to take care of just a few preliminary matters. First, if you brought a phone with you tonight, if you just take a moment to put that on silent, both for the sake of your neighbors and because we're recording tonight's lecture. Second, we're going to have a sign-up sheet circulating so that you can sign up and get on our mailing list and stay up to date with all of the latest Guroian events. We're going to use that sign-up list to do a book giveaway tonight. So we're going to be randomly selecting 3 people from that list to receive one of Dr. Guroian's books. And at the end of the night, we will announce the winners to that. So please go ahead and sign up for that mailing list. If you are already on our mailing list, go ahead, fill it out again, give us the most current information, and we'll make sure that you get entered in that drawing as well. Third, we're going to have some time for questions after tonight's lecture. So as you're listening, be sure to make note of any questions, thoughts that you have, so that we can consider them together afterward. And then finally, immediately after the lecture, there's going to be an open house just down the street at the Guroian CSF Study Center. And at the end of the lecture, I will provide a little bit more information on that and give you directions on how to get there. And now it's my privilege to invite Dr. Theophanis Stavru to introduce tonight's Homer lecturer. Dr. Stavru is a professor in history and in classical and Near Eastern studies here at the University of Minnesota. He's a leading authority on modern Russian history as well as Eastern Orthodoxy. And in light of tonight's theme on education, it's especially significant that Dr. Stavru has been a much beloved teacher and a mentor to hundreds of students during his years since 1961 here at the university. Dr. Stavru?
It is a great pleasure for me to be with you this evening for a number of good reasons. First of all, I knew Mr. Homer very well, And his son actually was a student at the University of Minnesota as well, and I attest to the qualities that were just expressed about that wonderful human being and scholar. Secondly, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce our speaker because it's really much more fun and much easier to introduce somebody whom you did not know very well. Sometimes, we are asked to introduce people whom we know, and usually it's easier. But I really have not met Professor Guroian until this evening. However, it's not fair to say that I did not know him at all. His first book, Incarnate Love, in this wonderfully distinctive cover, the first edition, has been in my library for a quarter of a century. And it's a kind of a book, really, whether you look at it this way or this way, somehow it grabs you. So you have to look at it. And I was hoping that someday I would meet him, and finally that opportunity came. But I read 3 of the 6 or 7 essays in this book, and I used them extensively, actually, in my course that I teach on Eastern Orthodoxy at the University of Minnesota. Now, there is another reason why I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker, because it really gives me an opportunity to say something that I do on very few occasions. I wouldn't be standing here before you this evening had it not been for a lovely Armenian lady who in the summer of 1952 went to play tennis on a small tennis court on the island of Cyprus, and her friend did not show up. And I happened to show up, and my partner did not show up either. So the two of us started playing tennis, and after that she invited me to go and meet her husband. And the rest of it is history. Through that wonderful Armenian woman, I began to develop my interest in coming and studying to the United States. Of course, Cyprus, where I come from, is a place where we have a lot of Armenians, and in fact we have probably one of the most successful Armenian schools outside in the diaspora, the so-called Melkonian Institute. So there are a lot of emotional reasons why this is a very special evening with me tonight, and the host for this evening's event told me that I had 5 minutes to fill, and you may think I have already taken 2, but 5 minutes is a long time. Fortunately, however, there is plenty to talk about our speaker. I think he has served the profession from what I was able to determine well, and when I said it's really more fun to introduce somebody whom you don't know well, it's just like when you're asked to comment on a paper, then you're forced to really do some work. And I did my homework, I think, and in addition to the favorable impressions I had on the basis of the limited exposure I had to this gentleman and his work, it's really nothing short of inspiring to see how well he has served the profession as a teacher, as a publishing scholar, as well as editor, and as a prolific author, as I said, as a publishing scholar. He got his BA from the University of Virginia, and then after that, he got his PhD from Drew University in theology. His first degree was in history. I oftentimes, as I read some of your autobiographical or biographical statements and something about your books, I wonder whether you're a historian with a theological bent or whether you are a theologian with a historical perspective. But any way you want to describe yourself, it's really a wonderful combination, supplementing these 2 disciplines, supplementing each other very nicely. I think it's a matter of credit to our speaker that after having taught at Loyola College in Maryland for about 20 years or so, he returned to his alma mater at the University of Virginia, where he's currently teaching. He's a professor of religion there, as well teaching courses on Eastern Christianity, which, by the way, is the most important reason why I was happy to have a chance to introduce him this evening, because he comes from the tradition, and he comes from one of the most venerable and older traditions in the Eastern Christian realm, as it were. He has received the Distinguished Teachers Award. He has also spoken in a number of other places besides the place where he is teaching. But it's really quite impressive that in addition to all this teaching, he's been such a prolific publishing scholar. And here are some of his books, which they speak for themselves. Let me tell you, however, why I thought this was going to be a wonderful introduction from my point of view. And I thought I was going to have only 50 seconds. And therefore, I selected the opening and concluding line. But since I was given 5 minutes, then I am doing what I am doing right now. But this is, but this is really what I found in the various things I looked at. And what a wonderful self-introduction this is. I am a theologian and a college professor. I like being both. But what I really love to do, what I get exquisite pleasure from doing, is to garden. I think that gardening is nearer to God than theology. In many respects, really, this introduction, as stated in the statement, is sufficient. But then you're all scholars, and you want evidence, right? All right, therefore, here comes the evidence. That his first book was published in 1987, and then it went in paperback in 1989, known as Incarnate Love, Essays in Orthodox Ethics. A wonderful first attempt from this young scholar, I think, to interact and engage really thinkers, Christian thinkers, from various branches of Christianity. His second publication, Tending the Heart of Virtue, How Classic Stories Awaken a Child's Moral Imagination, close to the topic that we are going to hear about tonight. And then he continued on with Inheriting Paradise, Meditations on Gardening. And, of course, how shall we remember? And this is an important detail in the life of this gentleman, because as you gather from the name, and as you gather from my introductory remarks, he's an Armenian. And when you're an Armenian, you simply cannot forget the past, and especially the unfortunate events of 1915, where, in other words, the Armenians suffered a tremendous assault, which can be described by any name, but in the final analysis, it really amounted to what it was, namely almost extermination of those people. Anyway, he's published a book really on that very topic, and he also continues his publication with the book which you have seen outside, The Fragrance of God, A Spirituality of Gardening, The Melody of Faith, Theology in an Orthodox Key, and currently he's expecting a book to come out of Oxford University Press on Orthodox theology on marriage. So he's been a very busy person, as you can tell. And I'm mentioning all these titles, not really because one gets impressed by titles. Because of the writing of books, there is no end, as somebody pointed out. But I mention it really chiefly because what impressed me about what I have been able to determine and what I'm looking forward to really understand better is that our distinguished guest this evening has really drawn, always in all the studies that I have looked and what I've read about, he draws on the scriptures, he draws on the church fathers, he draws on scholarship by Western theological thinkers, as well as the scholars of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this is really quite an arsenal, quite a combination of sources that he brings with him when he makes his presentation. And I'm sure that's going to reflect itself very easily in the presentation he's going to make tonight, which you have in front of you. But again, just to complete my 4.5 minutes, has the title, The Moral Imagination, Cultivating Virtue Through Great children's stories. For all these good reasons, it really is a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Vigen Guroian to give the 18th McLaren Lecture, the Holman Lecture, sponsored by the McLaren Institute. Professor Guroian.
I've never had an introduction like that, but I've never been introduced by a Greek academic in such a setting either. You should expect a talk from me on Orthodox Christianity, but it won't be. I will cite one Orthodox theologian, however, so I haven't left it behind. Professor Stavro was kind. He could have called me a dilettante and left it at that. Sometimes I think I am. My feet are in too many places at once, and I trip a lot. First of all, as far as Paul Homer is concerned, I actually know of him, but never met him. I know of him because one of my early colleagues at the University of Virginia, where I taught right out of graduate school from 78 to 81 and then returned many years later, was a student of his in philosophical theology, and all I heard about was Paul Homer, and learned to appreciate the man at a distance. It was a surprise and an amazement to me so many years later, 35 years later, to be invited to give a lecture that's named in his honor. So I do have a connection with that. My subject matter tonight grows out of my personal life every bit as much as out of my academic life. My children are now in their 30s. Well, my daughter just reached 30, my son's 34, and I have now 2 grandchildren, one who's 2 and one who's 3 months, and I'll see them tomorrow. So maybe I can go back to doing what I did with my children, which was read constantly to them children's stories. But at a certain point, I couldn't read those stories to them any longer because they wanted different stories. But I was attached to the very early stories. So I went to my dean at the time at Loyola College and asked him if he would give me a small stipend, because they were giving out such things at that point, to put together a course on children's literature. I was in the theology department. Well, a man has to be forgiven. He was a chemist. Worse still, he was what I call a flat planet. He had no conception of what this would do in a curriculum. He told me, maybe you should go talk to the people in the Department of Education. I said, they teach bibliography. They don't teach the stories. They teach bibliography. They won't be interested in this. That's, for those of you in education departments, you may be insulted by that, but that was the case. I knew that. So he didn't give me a stipend, flat planet that it was. I can forgive him for being a chemist because I wanted to be a chemist. My math wasn't very good, so I gave it up, but I really did want to be a chemist. I had one of those old chemistry lab, they used to sell them back then, things that they won't give children anymore. And I had a friend whose father was an inventor. He invented the pulleys and the old-fashioned windows, And he had a great laboratory, and when he died, he gave me the whole lab. I still have some of the glassware. It's probably worth millions. Not really, but there was lots of sulfuric acid and phosphorus and mercury. It's a wonder I'm alive. I once tried to make mercury fulminate, which is what they put at the tips of torpedoes. And I was frightened because I came up with something, so I buried it in my father's garden. And it's still there. Anyway. So for 20, 25 years, I've been teaching a course on religion and children's literature. And when I went back to UVA, I taught it. This will be the 3rd or 4th time I'll teach it next spring. It fills up in 3 hours. I limit it to, the online these days. When I was a college student, we chose our courses on index cards. I limit it to 30 students. My book grew out of that, 7th or 8th year of teaching the course, and I owe Oxford a second and expanded edition, which I hope to finish one day. But let me begin by simply reading to you and commenting as I go along. These are troubling times for our children, and the range of dangers that exist, physical, moral, and spiritual, should not be understated. They should not be underestimated. And in this environment, the great moral question of character and virtue becomes paramount, particularly in our roles as parents and teachers. Despite the chatter of all the modern sophists that reach us through the various media who profess that there is nothing absolute or permanent in morality, we are compelled to confirm the enduring and permanent things. More than this, we must not only affirm but also cultivate these things in the lives of our children, and that's what compelled me to write the book that I wrote. Those of us who are Christians believe that the universe in which we live is a moral one, governed by a just and gracious God. And we believe that our lives are of eternal value and significant. So the kind of ship into which we cast our children off into the sea of life makes a difference as to whether they sink into the abyss or reach the shores of paradise. Education is not just about teaching learning skills or training young people how to be well-adjusted. It is most importantly about making virtuous people. It is about cultivating the child's soul so that she is a temple fitted for the Holy Spirit. Quickly, I was invited some years back by a member of the faculty of the business school at Fordham University in Manhattan who wanted to play a trick on the rest of the faculty. They had a faculty lecture every year, invited a speaker. So he asked me to speak on why businessmen should read great literature. And I, at one point, said that you are in the business of dealing with human souls and their formation. And I have to tell you, there was a grumbling, more than a grumbling, an objection to the notion that first there was a soul, and secondly, that we had any business dealing with this in our education. That was even more pleasurable. From there on, I knew that I was going to have a great wrestling match. I had them captive, too, because I was at the podium. It is about making virtuous persons, and it is about cultivating the child's soul. It is about building up in the child a moral imagination that will serve her throughout the whole of life. Dare we say, even it is about nurturing those virtues Jesus spoke of on the Mount of Beatitudes. First, let us consider the virtues to which the moral imagination is in service. The virtues are like gems. Each is solid with a permanent color and shape. If we throw a diamond into a pond, let it stay for 1,000 years. The diamond will not change or diminish in beauty, and there will be no mistaking it for a common stone. The virtues are like that. They are among the permanent things of divine and human nature, and they possess an enduring quality. We have names for the virtues. Every great religion and culture has names for the virtues. Among these are love and justice, faith and courage, temperance and hope. If we embrace and practice the virtues, they become our habit, and holiness is even within our reach. St. Peter tells us that, and I quote him, we may become partakers of the divine nature. He then goes on to say, however, that in order to make good this gift of the Spirit, we ourselves must, with all diligence, add to our faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness. 2 Peter chapter 1. So we should not be ashamed to say that we want our children to be just, or good, or holy. We should not hesitate to say, even to those who have completely forgotten the meaning of holiness, or do not believe in its reality or possibility, that our children should be holy. Rather, we should take instruction and encouragement from Christ, who instructed, "Be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect." The virtues are our path to becoming fully human. They define and constitute character. They are precedent even to the choices we make. We do not invent them. Rather, they belong to human nature, and human nature is not whole without them. They direct our will so that our actions serve goodness and justice. No one chooses to be courageous any more than he or she chooses to be cowardly. One is either courageous or one is cowardly. There is no in-between. When we say a person is courageous, we mean that the virtue of courage belongs to the very essence of who and what that person is. How do the virtues come into existence? They come to exist through example and exercise, initially in the home, and hence through the offices that we first assume, as sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, and then in the school or in the playing field. The virtues grow into habits that define the will, even before volition. Moral character, a virtuous character, is therefore a habitual orientation of the self toward the world that disposes a person to act out of a sense of what is right and to do that which is good in every instance. So think of the virtues as the powers of habit that enable us to avoid evil and to do what is good and to grow into wholeness and holiness. Moral rules and principles are not sufficient. They need the virtues in the moral imagination. Their application for good or ill depends entirely upon the character of the agent and the spiritual light of the moral imagination that illumines the landscape of a person's life. If we merely memorize moral rules and principles without the support of virtue or the moral imagination, we can just as easily use these rules and principles for selfish and pernicious purposes as for the good. Sailors need to know when to use ballast or throw down the anchor, lest the ship sink and they drown. Likewise, the virtues enable us to respond correctly to those moments of life that are the moral equivalents to such conditions at sea. However, an ability to discern these moments and respond appropriately entails more than formal techniques of decision-making. Just as successful sailing requires that one knows more than precisely the techniques of good navigation. As the latter requires a knowledge and familiarity with the sea, so in the case of the moral life, the virtues are the basis of all of our actions that we may count as good and as directive toward the perfection of our character. In his profound essay, The Education of Character, Martin Buber, that great Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, tells a story that illustrates this point. He recalls an early experience while teaching a course on ethics and explains how he committed the terrifying mistake of giving mere moral instruction in rules and principles rather than attending to the formation of character in his pupils. I quote, "I try to explain to my pupils that envy is despicable and at once I feel the secret resistance of those who are poorer than their comrades. I try to explain that it is wicked to bully the weak, and at once I see a suppressed smile on the lips of the strong. I try to explain that lying destroys life, and something frightful happens. The worst habitual liar of the class produces a brilliant essay, on the destructive power of lying. Whether or not a carpenter is a good man will not necessarily determine the effectiveness of how he handles a saw or hammer, or the quality of the cabinets that he builds. But morality is different. Moral rules and principles are not mere tools, like the carpenter's saw and hammer. The correct use of moral rules and principles, as he's illustrated in what he has just said about his early teaching experience, depends entirely upon the character of the agent and the manner in which the agent inhabits the world. That's the point that Buber made so profoundly in the citation I just gave to you. Likewise, law is not the heart and soul of morality either. The old legalism that imagines it can cover every contingency of life with rules and sanctions is just as flawed as the reformist doctrine, which prescribes that all one need do is teach children to think for themselves, and they will find a moral compass, as if they can invent their own math. A child wants to know the fixed things, not the shifting. G.K. Chesterton once wisely observed and went on to say, "For the child enjoys the sea, not the tides." He cannot decently be expected to learn to respect humanity, which is often a hard thing to do, and at the same moment to learn to improve it. Chesterton also believed that stories are the most powerful medium through which we can acquaint young people with these fixed or permanent things of the moral life, and not the shifting sands or the waves. He believed that we live storied lives. And so it is to stories and their special capacity to engender the virtues, build character, and birth the moral imagination to which I turn now. In my own teaching of college students, I regularly invoke stories and bring them into the classroom. Though I do not belong to a department of literature, nonetheless I also regularly assign literature and poetry in my courses. I begin my course on ecology, Christianity, and culture reading poetry and hymns, which astonishes most of the students in the class who are environmental studies majors of one kind and cannot comprehend how this could do with policy study. Same rule applies. I said, who does policy? What is the character of the people who do policy? I want to affect your sensibilities. I'm not interested in discussing policy. You'll get more than enough of it in all of the other classes that you take. That's how I start. And it's a wonderful experiment. And it works. Now, stories are especially important in children's lives because they make up for the life experience they lack, these stories, or for which they are not yet prepared in the case of children. They introduce children to the virtues through characters with which they may identify as they themselves struggle to exercise their freedom imaginatively and responsibly in relation to their families and friends and the rest of their growing world. Stories bestow images to memory that become metaphors for a moral imagination. The moral imagination is built up from these analogies and metaphors, for it is through such analogies and metaphors that we gain the capacity to draw correspondences in life that enable us to act responsibly and to make moral judgments. As I have been saying, rote memory does not make moral behavior. An eminent philosopher of the last century, George Santayana, once stated, and this is a striking statement, I stop when I read it, always. Our perceptions do not remain in the mind, as would be suggested by the trite simile of the seal and the wax, passive and changeless until they fade. Rather, perceptions fall into the brain as seeds into a furrow, or even as sparks into a keg of powder. And these images in turn give life to more images, sometimes slowly and subterraneously, sometimes with a sudden burst of fancy. End of quote. And here I might add, is the store of what I'm calling the moral imagination. In other words, the moral imagination is active, not just in our conscious and waking life, but also in our subconscious, even as we sleep. It is the self's ongoing process of finding moral direction and purpose in life. It is neither reason nor instinct, but rather an attribute and expression of the freedom and the passion, the memory and reason that distinguish human beings from the rest of the animal kingdom. And for an audience such as this, need I emphasize what a difference it makes in our lives, especially in our early years, what kind of images reach our eyes and our minds, and that we even experience in our bodies, in the whole of what and who we are as human beings living in a social world. We must never underestimate the power of images, whether pictorial or communicated through word and story. The contemporary Orthodox theologian Andrew Louth has said, and I quote him, that images mediate. Images bring one thing in relation to another. Images make meaning. And they do this because this is the way things are. This is the way God has made the world. St. Basil of Caesarea said, God imagines the creation into existence. He doesn't, and I go along with that. He doesn't reason it. It's not a function of what we call intellect. God imagines it into existence. Those images become real. He makes them real. And they're contemplated from eternity into eternity. And I think that's what Louth is getting at here. So he says, and they do this because this is the way things are. This is the way God has made the world. And it all relates and interconnects, and images reveal this relationship and interconnection. Now, in our time, which one could rightly name the age of the tyranny of images, when all the wrong sorts of images reach our eyes, we have to be especially attentive to their significance. We must not take them for granted and be ever vigilant for our children's sake, for the images that reach their eyes and penetrate their imaginations. Why? Because Satan is the great pretender and the imitator of God. That's why. He knows the power of images, and he uses them to deceive and seduce our imaginations. There, I've said it. It's not supposed to be said in academic settings. So what? I'm too old to care. Besides, I have 2 grandchildren to worry about. So let's think of the moral imagination as a special form of perception. It is light, like the light that enters the eyes and enables one to see. Whilst in the darkness there is much that we cannot and do not see. Moral vision is the capacity to tell goodness from evil and respond in each circumstance to bring goodness about rather than evil. So much of the moral failure in our world is a failure of imagination, not just of a will that chooses to do what is wrong. Let me repeat that, because the longer I've lived, the more I've come to the conclusion that this is the case. So much of the moral failure in the world is a failure of imagination, and not just of a will that chooses to do what is wrong. Satan attacks not only our reason and will, but also our imagination. Indeed, as all the saints testify, he goes first to the imagination. Phantasmagoria. They need to be expelled. He corrupts and distorts it into forms with which we are all too familiar, though we may choose to ignore or deny their existence. Worse, there are dysmorphic and corrupted forms of imagination that in our time threaten to completely crowd out the moral imagination, like weeds in an untended garden. There are 3 such forms of imagination that warrant special attention. First is the idyllic imagination. The idyllic imagination is escapist. not necessarily in the sense that it flees physical surroundings, but rather that it shirks civic and social and personal responsibility. In its rebellious or revolutionary form, which I'm quite acquainted with as a child of the 60s, it denies and strives to destroy old dogmas, manners, and mores. In its search for the idyllic, it might also turn to hedonistic imaginings and flagrant sensuality, as it seeks liberation from existing conventions and norms. The second is the idolatrous imagination, so rampant in our society today as that it has built its own cult of celebrity, our version of the pagan pantheon of divinities. And today we call celebrity idols icons. Now, some time ago, Christianity made a distinction between idols and icons. We've completely confounded these two, to our great and grave danger, it seems to me. This is not just a harmless confusion of terms. And the adoration we give these stars, whether of cinema, sports, or in politics, comes not without damage to the soul. The third deformation of imagination is the diabolic imagination. Not much need to be said about it than the name. Oftentimes it takes hold of us when the idyllic and idolatrous forms fail us. Neither idyllic fantasies nor man-made divinities can satisfy the soul's yearning for communion and happiness. The diabolic imagination is a dive heels up, to use a phrase of Dostoevsky, into complete desolateness. It is spiritual suicide, followed by physical suicide. But it is the moral imagination about which I speak, and in order that we may apply moral rules to a right result, the moral imagination has to be in place, and it must be active. Yet modern education largely ignores this truth, and I believe we're failing to introduce our children to a world of metaphors and symbols upon which the strength of the moral imagination depends utterly. The great Victorian inventor of fantasy literature, one of my favorites and perhaps some of yours, George MacDonald, observed that if we wish to develop the moral imagination in children, and I quote him, "No doubt the best beginning is an acquaintance with nature." How much nature do you see or hear with ear pods in your? When you shut your ears off, you shut your eyes too. The senses work together. It's tragic. You're walking along the grounds at the University of Virginia, beautiful grounds, and the leaves are rustling, and my students don't hear them, nor do they see them, because they don't hear them. They don't see them because they don't hear them. They don't hear them because they don't see them. And it has its results, its consequences. So he writes, "No doubt the best beginning is an acquaintance with nature." Thus, MacDonald argued that children should be encouraged, quote, to observe vital phenomena. He doesn't mean scientifically either. Poetically observe them, too. To put things together. To speculate from what they see to what they do not see. End of quote. The sort of attentiveness to nature that MacDonald recommends runs much deeper than even the sort of observation and experimentation that natural science calls for. And need I mention how much we neglect this form of observation in daily life? Leave aside informal education. MacDonald was recommending an exercise in poesis, an exercise in the use of language to get to the very quiddity or essence of things, to see the world in its wholeness, and to find meaning in our relationship to the world. And he reminds us that even in, I quote him, "the coldest word was once a glowing metaphor and bold, questionable originality." Thy very attention, he writes, does it not mean attentio, the Latin, a stretching to? Take any word of emotion, take the word emotion itself, he continues, and you will find that its primary meaning is of the outer world. The rustling and agitation of the trees is analogized to the self and its inner disturbances, thus emotion. The imagination grasps the symbolic nature of the world itself and transforms human language and knowing in the process. And if we don't prepare our children, don't put them in the proper environment in which they go through this process at the earliest age, we fail them, period. And we're failing them. Monstrously so, in my view. Really failing them. For many years, I taught at Loyola College in Baltimore. And in my ethics course, I am an ethicist after all. Well, that's one of my hats. In my ethics course one year, I assigned Walker Percy's novel, The Thanatos Syndrome. The last of his novels, a crazy novel. The protagonist of his story is a character we've met before in his novels, a psychiatrist named, of all things, Thomas More. More has a theory about human types, and we learn about this very early, very first pages. He divides his patients into those who are bluebirds and those who are blue jays. It became apparent to me that my students did not understand More's metaphor. So I asked the students, 60 of them in 2 sections, if they knew the respective habits and temperament of bluebirds and blue jays. There were maybe 4 or 5 out of those 60 students that could describe both, and fewer that could explain why there was a contrast between a bluebird and a blue jay. Now, when I was a child, I was outside. It wasn't always good. I got muddy. I came home late. My parents put it to me, and I did it again. But I was outside chasing frogs and things like that. And I watched birds even. Yeah, I watch them more now because my children say I'm getting addled and aged. But I think of the birds as the fish in the sea that have that glorious advantage of floating around in the sea. And what are we? We're just the crustaceans that crawl around the bottom, you say. So I envy the birds. But my students obviously never observed birds. They were all suburban kids. Maybe the birds didn't even come to their yards anymore because we've taken away all the trees and the foliage that the birds actually feed off of or nest in. But in any case, what a sad thing to observe in young men and women. They couldn't get the metaphor. I did the same thing with metaphors in John Updike's Rabbit Run. I gave him a test on, give me 5 metaphors in the book. Some of them didn't even identify the title. Seriously. That doesn't mean I don't love my students, I do, but something's missing. I can't make up for it entirely, not by that time. It's not that my students lacked a practical definition of a metaphor. They were given that in their English courses. I know because I had good friends in the English department. And I asked them about this. They had been provided with a definition of a metaphor, but what they lacked was the habit of observation and poesis, to which MacDonald refers. They lacked the personal knowledge of metaphor, which only an active moral imagination engenders. I not only suspect that they spend too much time indoors looking at a screen or outdoors equipped with earbuds, I also am sure that they spent years in school being taught that learning is about collecting facts from specially prepared books that require little interpretation. We live in a culture where metaphor is discarded to make room for these so-called facts. The practice is justified by the prejudice that these facts, and exclusively so, in them resides the truth. So we train minds to detect these facts, much as we break in a baseball glove. For those who remember how to do that, you used to oil the glove and wrap it up, wait for overnight, magic will occur. Meanwhile, the imagination is neglected, and it's left unguarded and untrained. In the last analysis, the moral imagination is that distinctively human capacity to conceive of men and women as moral and spiritual beings, as persons and not as things. In other words, to recognize that the human face is itself a window into spirit which might otherwise be hidden from us. The best of humankind's stories possess a special power to perceive spirit in the world. and thus to recognize and affirm truth through metaphor. In this case, my use of window is a metaphor. And I hope here you will excuse the theologian for using the speech with which he is most accustomed for the imago Dei, the image of God that every human being is. Image of God. We are images of God. Images. Need I remind you of how inferior and destructive are so many of the stories that feed the popular imagination? Created for television, video, computer games, cinema, advertising. These stories have replaced other profound stories that once played such a vital role in the formation and handing on of faith and culture. The wisdom I recommend is universal wisdom, and it's next to tragically being forgotten or ignored, either out of laziness or just for the sake of profit. In Plato's Republic, Socrates rhetorically asks, "Shall we then thus lightly suffer our children to listen to any chance stories fashioned by any chance teachers, and so take into their minds opinions, for the most part contrary to those we shall think it desirable for them to hold when they are grown up? By no manner of means will we allow it." Biblical illiteracy is given in my theology classes, so too illiteracy of the classics, but this is not the end of it. Illiteracy in the great fairy tales is just as pervasive. In my writing and speaking, I've urged a return to the tried and true fairy tales that the Victorians and Edwardians in the English-speaking world of the 19th and early 20th century brought into the nursery and the schoolroom, and also those stories they created themselves. G.K. Chesterton wrote of the test of fairyland. "This is the test of imagination," he wrote, "and this test of imagination concerns moral truth," Chesterton insisted. But moral truth is different from mathematical truth. He wrote, you cannot imagine 2 and 1 not making 3, but you can imagine easily trees not growing fruit. And I add, but rather rock candy, since I loved that song when I was a child. The lesson of fairyland, however, is not that tomorrow morning you or I should expect to find growing in their backyard a tree whose limbs are weighted down with rock candy. The magic of fairyland is not physical or biological science. A fairy tale may tell of an evil witch who possesses the mysterious power to turn a good prince into a stone, and a fairy godmother with the equally mysterious power to turn that stone prince back into his rightful self. But the veracity of the moral truths illumined by these two inhabitants of fairy tales does not depend upon an explanation of their powers, as would be perhaps with science. Fairy tales are not science, though they are a way of knowing every bit as important to human well-being as scientific knowledge. If we look in the fairy tale for an explanation of the transformative power of the fairy godmother, as we look for an explanation of science of how liquids turn into solids, we are bound to come up empty-handed and disappointed. Rather, the magic of the fairy tale lies in its capacity to make us see that we, each and every one of us, are capable of committing both the evil of the wicked witch and the good of the fairy godmother. The great fairy tales enable us to see what is the difference between good and evil and judge whether we ourselves are like the wicked witch or like the fairy godmother. And children are great at that experiment. The great fairy tales challenge us to test our imaginations, how we would respond to circumstances in which good and evil are in the balance. They invite us to make correlations between the imaginary characters and worlds they depict and the world in which we live. In this way, fairy tales exercise and build up the moral imagination, and they engender virtue. Plato argued that conversion to that which is moral, that which is just, that which is right and good is like an awakening, like remembering something long forgotten. Symbols, allegories, fables, myths, and good stories, they have a special capacity to bring back to life the starved or atrophied moral imagination. Thus, through dramatic depictions between the struggle between good and evil, and the presentation of characters that embody and enact the possibilities therein, moral vision clears. Light comes into our eyes, an illumination of our darkened intellects, a warming of our frozen hearts. Fairy tales are not scientific hypotheses, nor are they practical guides to living. But they do something even better. They resonate with the deepest qualities of our humanity. They have the capacity to draw us into the mystery of morality and virtue. And they enable us to envision a world in which there are norms and limits, and freedom respects the moral law or pays an especially high price. Fairy tales show us that there is a difference between what is logically possible and what is morally felicitous, what is rationally doable and what is morally permissible. In fairy tales, the character of real law belongs to neither natural necessity nor rational determinism. Rather, real law is a comprehensible sign of a primal, unfathomable freedom and a numinous reality and will. Real law, the realest law, can be obeyed or broken, and in either case, for the very same reason, because the creature is both subject of and participation in this primal freedom. And even the smallest child knows that freedom to be welling up inside him or her. We have to respect it, and we have to instruct it. I can't say much more. Fairy tale heroes are called to be free and responsible, thus virtuous and respectful of the moral law. After a child has read Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen, it's magnificent, it's his best, really. Or C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, or Grimm's Cinderella, not Disney, not Perrault for that matter, on which Disney based Israel, but Grimm's Cinderella. The moral imagination is sure to have been stimulated and sharpened, because these stories offer powerful images of good and evil, and they show a child how to love or act with courage through the examples of the character he or she has come to love and admire. And the memories of these stories and these characters become the analogs that the moral imagination uses to make real-life decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously. And these memories become constitutive elements of a child's self-identity and character, so that a well-fortified and story-enriched moral imagination helps children to move about in the world with moral intent, and ultimately with faith, hope, and charity. When the moral imagination is wakeful, the virtues come to life, and they're filled with personal and existential as well as social significance. The virtues needn't be dry and lifeless data of moral theories or the ethical version of hygienic rules in health science classes. They can take on a life that attracts and awakens the desire to own them for oneself. And that's what the best children's stories, the great classic children's stories, do. I don't want to leave you with the impression that fairy tales are only for the very young. For more than 20 years now, as I mentioned, I taught a college course titled Religion in Children's Literature. And each year, the young men and women speak up in the seminar to say that they were deprived in their childhood of these resources. Many of them do. Most of them, actually, in the end. Not only were they not introduced to most of the stories and books on the syllabus, but they also recognized that their natural sense of wonder was deprived in some fashion or another. I know why they're in there, too, because they want to revisit their childhood, because they know where they're going next. They're leaving college, and so they come. They want to revisit it for the last time. But what stuns them is that what they're revisiting is not, what they think they're going to revisit is not all that they will be revisiting, because so much of it has been left out of their family life and education. So I don't have to persuade them that the tasty food of fairy tales and classic stories that we read in class is good for the soul. Books like Bambi, The Secret Garden, The Wind in the Willows, the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, list goes on. My students take advantage of these stories to revisit childhood for one last time, and it's a wonderfully satisfying experience for them, but also for me. They also find themselves looking back in order to look forward, and they especially enjoy and are perplexed by Peter Pan, the real Peter Pan, not Disney, the play or the novel. We read the novel, which Barry wrote after the play was a great success, and the Mowgli stories in Kipling's Jungle Books, since they are about two children who don't want to grow up or join the real human world. But these stories end differently. Peter refuses to join the lost boys in the Darling household, and he returns to Neverland instead and remains a child and a prisoner of his own passions, though he continues to think this is freedom. And by contrast, the love and the wisdom of his animal mentors help Mowgli to mature as a moral being, and he struggles with choices and takes responsible action to protect beasts and human beings whom he loves, and his character is refined, and he re-enters human society a mature young man, not without agony, but he re-enters it. But then agony is part of it, not just in Mowgli's life. Now, I recognize that the views I've expressed do not belong to the common stock of contemporary educational orthodoxy. I've read much of the literature on children's literature because I feel as if I need to be responsible for it. But frankly, I don't find it of much use, honestly, because it's not interested in these subjects matters, more or less. I realize that the appeals I make to a common human nature and a perennial literature defy postmodernist premises that even affect our views on ordinary pedagogy, though there are many who receive these views unaware of just what the underlying anthropology is, and that gives rise to these views. But the stories say it all. They speak of things that are perennial, such things as the joy of the birth of the first child and the crippling sorrow of illness and deformity, childhood fears of getting lost, matched by childhood desires to escape parental authority, the love that binds siblings and the rivalry that tears them apart, the naming we do that gives identity, and the blessings of welcome benefactors, the agony of unrequited love, and the joy of love that is reciprocated. That's the stuff of the best stories, including the stories we can read to our children. I believe in moral truths that enable us to live and prosper and which are no less important to living than the nutrition we receive from food and drink. Especially when young, we need to be fed on these truths as they come to us through the great stories of our race. I agree with all my heart and mind what G.K. Chesterton leaves us with when he speaks to us about our responsibility to children as adults, as parents and teachers, welcoming them into this world. He wrote, "The truth of our human tradition and handing it on with a voice of an authoritative, unshaken voice, that is the eternal education. To be sure enough that something is true, that you dare tell it to a child." Now, I'm almost finished, but I do want to say a word or two about a particular story. I'm often asked, what is your favorite fairy tale? Well, which is it that above all others ought we to read to our children at home or the classroom? This is really an impossible question to answer. And the answer I give is not one I'm confident that parents and teachers will actually accept once they read it for themselves. But if they read it to their children, they might be persuaded. And that story is Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio, which was first published in 1883. I chose it for the first of the stories to discuss in my book, Tending the Heart of Virtue, entitled the chapter on becoming a real human child. In that chapter, however, I did not act so much as a theologian as the ethicist. I did not emphasize as much as I might have the brilliant way in which Cultivating integrates into this tale of a puppet profound themes and narrative elements from classical literature, the Bible, and Christian liturgy, really. In his own education, Cultivating imbibed and took to heart Homer's Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Augustine's Confessions, Dante's Divine Comedy, and I suspect also Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And he borrowed elements of these great works for his tale of a puppet. Cultivating was theologically educated. In his youth, he attended an Augustinian seminary. He became a journalist and advocate of reform in Italy. Into Pinocchio, however, he wove motifs and themes from these readings that he did early in his life, from the Bible, especially Genesis and the book of Jonah, as well as Jesus' parables, such as the story of the prodigal son, and the gospel accounts of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances on the road to Emmaus and in Galilee, even the crucifixion, because in the Cultivating story, Pinocchio is hung on a tree and wails, "Father, where are you?" Not in Disney. We all begin as puppets, marionettes, do we not? Isn't being a child something like being a puppet on a string? What is more, Cultivating's puppet is made from a troublesome and trouble-bound piece of wood, not in Disney's story. An allegory of our fallen human nature. The stubborn, wooden-headed puppet does not listen to his father and other wise counselors. There is a cricket, he's not named Jiminy Cricket, and he hits him with a hammer on a wall, and he's dead. He comes back as a ghost. It's European, it's not American, it's not sentimental. Seriously. Americans don't like that. And what Disney did was, brilliantly, recreated Pinocchio as an American innocent. And he's not in Cultivating's work. Instead of listening to his father and his counselors, he's struck with wanderlust and wanders from home like Odysseus. And he wants to return home, yet is hindered by all sorts of external powers, confused and confounded by inner conflicts, attracted to things that he ought not to be attracted to, distractions. He yearns for his father, but must learn how to love unselfishly in order to rescue his father from the belly of a great Leviathan. He suffers for his innocence and his misbehavior, a paradoxical mix of childhood, innocence, and misbehavior, and is hung on a tree to die. But for the intervention of a mysterious blue-haired fairy, that is his sister and his mother, could it be the Virgin? This would have been his end, and without her guidance and discipline, he surely would remain a vagabond. He calls himself such, and is called such by the ghost of the cricket. A vagabond, and never become a true pilgrim or find his father. In the end, Pinocchio risks his own life to save his father's life, sacrifices his own needs to care for the aging Geppetto, and to assist the blue-haired fairy when she falls ill. He has learned filial love, how to be a good son, and for these deeds in his good heart, his virtuous heart, and what he has become inside, Pinocchio has been made a real boy with real flesh and blood, though surely even before this physical transformation, he had gained his humanity. Or is this really an allegory of immortality? Aren't we all puppets made of wood, wanting and struggling to become real in the kingdom that knows no end? And what does it mean to become real? Why to be formed into the very likeness of God, same who we saw in the divine word and only begotten Son of God, who showed us what we might become by coming to us in the form of a man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guroian. I know that this talk has probably raised a number of questions in your mind, and so we've set aside a good amount of time here to take questions. So we've got a mic here, and I will come around. If you can just put your hand up, I will come and find you. And one of the things we value very highly at McLaurin is pursuing learning in the context of community. And so this is very valuable to us to get this interaction and allow you to ask the questions that you want to ask.
Yes, up there. Man.
Professor, you've given us a really great talk to think about with a lot of richness going on in it. And I'm curious as someone who works with 5th and 6th graders in the inner city, I'm curious as to how you see this playing out practically with inner city students and especially with students who English isn't their first language.
English wasn't my first language, so who cares? They thought I was stupid. My IQ scores were below average. So, but I had a grandmother who told me stories of the Middle East. Comedic stories, tragic stories. I didn't know whether the stories were real or true. Tell them stories. They love stories. Waste your time. Don't use your curriculum. Go outside and play. They might get hurt. So what? We all get hurt. I'm being facetious in a way, but I'm being absolutely brutally honest with you. We've got it all wrong. They can be taught. You're darn right they've been taught. I was virtually an immigrant kid. I used to make fun of me because of the way I dressed. So what? Believe in them. I don't. You have a privilege that I don't have. I've often said that if I could teach again, I'd teach 4th graders. I love 4th graders. 5th, too, but 6th starts to gets difficult for me. But you see, the really important years are up till about the 4th grade. They're really important years. But then, there's the parents. What do you do with children who... I had an intact family. I understand. There is a difference. I don't know. There are a lot of things working against what I would suggest has to be done, but I know it's being done at various schools, mostly not in the public schools, mostly in the classical schools that are rising up. I mean, I was down in Arizona, in Phoenix, where there's a group that's started, you should call it kind of school, charter schools. They have 10,000 on the waiting list. They're founding 20 schools a year. They're now going into Texas. The problem is they can't do it up here. The legislation doesn't permit them to hire the way they need to hire. I just sent a student down there, one of my best. He doesn't have a teaching degree. He doesn't need one. He's in a classroom with a mentor teacher. Besides, I know he can teach better than most anyhow. He's a classics and language major, linguistics major. They can hire him. Public schools can't hire him. It's crazy. Yes.
Let's use the mic here since we're recording.
All right. In regard to the moral imagination, I figure part of it has to do with approaching other people as people with different desires and intentions. Whereas so much of childhood in the United States seems focused around the child as decision maker rather than the child as interacting with other decision makers. I know in some children's stories, I know French ones, it's very clear that one person has one goal and another person has another goal. And these will quite frequently conflict, and not in a way that will be mediated nicely. I don't see that in American storytelling. Not children's storytelling, anyways.
I don't know. I can't answer to the professional storytellers that visit schools and other community locations. But I would say that children aren't decision makers; they're explorers. And if we think that they're decision makers, or we think they ought to become decision makers, we've made a big mistake. We've made the wrong decision. Period. Yes.
Thanks. I have a 3-year-old and a 16-month-old at home. And one of the questions I have is, how do you, we're striving to teach our kids the truth of the Bible, and that it's true and it happened in its history. How do you balance that with fairy tales so that it's not a confusing, some of our stories are true in history and some of these are not.
Children will sort it out. I've often suggested, there's a long-standing debate within Christianity as to the role that, for example, pagan mythology plays in education. Should it play any role in education or not? There are some Christian theologians right from the beginning who argue that anything pagan was untouchable. There are others who argued, who had been educated as rhetoricians and philosophers in the classics, who insisted that you should read the classics. That John Chrysostom, for example, addressing parents, said, have them read the great heroes of the Greeks, because eventually they'll come across the one hero. They'll be able to identify and recognize him. He will contain and have all the virtues and more that those heroes had, and that's Jesus Christ. I agree with John Chrysostom. And I also think that it would be very profitable to juxtapose classic mythology, certain stories, with biblical stories, particularly Old Testament stories, which have the language of fable in them, whether or not they're true. I mean, the language, the way the story is told is a way in which it's quite comparable to the classic legends and myths of the Greek world. So I don't have a problem with this. I don't think that your concern should be so much about that. I think they will sort it out for themselves living in a pious home.
I have another question back here.
I had a question with regard to the stories you mentioned, or the stories that have, from a while ago. There's tons, if you go to a bookstore, like my children, there's lots of different stories. There's lots of different books. There's lots of it and if you look at some of them have agendas. There's agendas within those. So what is your take, or what's your opinion of some of the more the modern stories in the literature, the modern children's literature, where particularly the last 20 years, which has been fairly, it seems
The
like
last
there's
20
been
years
an
is what
explosion.
I've lost track of, because my children
Well, that's
shorter than that period of time.
But you will soon.
Well, I will be able to catch up, but I can say one thing. I think that in the 20th century, one of the great achievements of children's literature has been the picture book. The illustrator, where you have might have two authorial voices, the illustrator and the writer. And there's some great children's literature that's been produced over the years. One early one would have been, very early, would have been the Velveteen Rabbit. When I taught on occasion at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Seminary and the Ecumenical Institute there, I used to get a number of people that were either pastors or nurses and so forth. Some of them worked in homes for the elderly, and that was the story they used. Because in a way, the Velveteen Rabbit's experience is about becoming old. And it's also about how being loved can make you real. And maybe the Velveteen Rabbit is in the kingdom at the end, isn't he? He's transformed into a real rabbit. Paradise. And I hope you don't think my imagination is too wild, but I actually believe that that story could only have been created within Christendom, at the very end of Christendom. The Edwardian period. So you have to, it's puzzling. I just want to add this. There's so much out there. Go for the tried and true first. Just go for the tried and true first. And don't be allured by all that's on the shelves. Most of it is junk. Not all of it, I told you. I mean, there's some great children's literature that's been produced in the 20th century.
Professor, a couple of times you mentioned Plato's Republic in your lecture.
Yeah.
And in that book, Plato has Socrates ban the poets, or at least types of poetry, from the city and speech. And my question to you is, do you believe that these stories are the acceptable type of poetry or the unacceptable type of poetry? How would you respond to Plato's Socrates?
I'd read Aristotle. So, I have the advantage of reading Plato and Aristotle. Yeah, that's what I do. I mean, I don't have to accept everything that, or make judgments about Plato's judgments, except maybe implicitly. I'm not a great scholar of Plato, but I've read Plato and I've read Aristotle, and I know they say some different things, and there are truths in each of them. So if I read Aristotle's Poetics or his Ethics, I gain a great deal. I like those. I like much of the Republic as well, but I don't mean to be facetious there. I don't know how I'd have to think more about exactly what your question is. In simple terms, it's not unlike, it's analogous to the point I made earlier about early Christian writers and theologians as to what Christians ought to be absorbing out of the literature and poetry that's available in their own time. And there's great disagreement. Some will destroy anything that's pagan, others will not. I happen to be with those who would not. But I know there are others who can argue the case the other way. It's not to say that I'm not going to be, I am going to be discriminating, yes.
I'll just ask a quick, specific question. Wondering if you have any comment on the work of P.L. Travers as great literature for children, all the Mary Poppins stories.
I read the original, whatever.
Not Disney.
I know, not Disney. Well, I like Disney. When I knock Disney, there's some really good Disney. It's gotten pretty bad in recent years, but Disney was brilliant. Walt. And they were true to the fairy tales in a way that they're not now. I mean, really, seriously. The Little Mermaid. The music is, it's enjoyable. I like listening to it. My granddaughter was listening to it the other day. She was having a lot of fun. Under the sea, I just want to say something about Disney. For example, was it the first? I don't know. Was the Sleeping Beauty, or which was the first of them? Snow White. That's what I want. They ended the way that the Grimms ended. She's there for 3 days in the tomb, and on the third day she rises, and the prince comes. The prince, uppercase, the Son of God. They ended right. They retained that. I don't know who was doing the editing. They didn't have to be true to the 3 days. Somebody was there, knew what it meant, probably. Or maybe they were just being literal at that point, didn't know what the devil they were doing. All I know is it was retained. But The Little Mermaid is a profound story with all sorts of biblical resonances, even though there's no question that Hans Christian Andersen was idiosyncratic as a Christian. He didn't believe in the physical resurrection. And there are hints and suggestions of it in that story as well. But the spiritual struggle that the Little Mermaid goes through in his story is true to the Old and New Testaments. In some ways comparable to David's refusal to use a spear to do away with his one enemy, the king, Saul. And she refuses to use what she can use to save herself at the very end, the knife. The knife and her feet, as he describes it, are constantly feeling as if knives are piercing her feet. But she does not pierce his heart. And she gives up immortality. Or so she thinks. So, they destroyed that story. Now, what was the real question?
It's about the original Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins. I don't have a lot to say about that. I enjoyed Mary Poppins, but I never thought about it the way I thought about just reflected on The Little Mermaid. It takes time to think about these stories. If you really want to think about them, then I have to write about them, right? So I didn't get to Mary Poppins. I think it's good, but I don't know that I can argue with someone who has the opposite point of view because I just don't have it. Do you want to say something about Mary Poppins?
No, other than that, in the kind of Christian great literature or lists of books, it's rarely included.
Yes.
In the 20th century.
Yeah.
And I think there's about 20 reasons it should be.
It should be.
Yeah.
I'll go back and look at it. It doesn't mean that there's lots of children's literature that I read that I thought was pretty good at the time. Freddie the Pig. Did anyone ever read that? They were great. Let's see. The Lost Planet stories. What was that name of the Mushroom Planet stories? Remember those? They were good. They were fun. They were entertaining. They were adventure. They set a mood. They set an atmosphere, and I can still taste it. So that it's not to say that you've got to be a Puritan about this. It's how much of Christianity was in the Mushroom Planet stories. I don't know. I doubt very little. But it was fun to read. So, or Mr. Poppins. What was the name of that Mr. Huh? What was that? Wait, what? So, Mr. Poppins' Penguins, yes. Now, I didn't see the movie, but I liked the book. I think it was a good book. I still think it was probably a good book, but I'm not sure. So I haven't gone back and read it. But, that's what I'm getting at here. If you say that there's stuff in there that qualifies it, in a certain class, if you like, of children's literature that I would be most attracted to in terms of writing about, I'll take your word for it. Maybe it is there. I didn't read into it. After all, you have to understand, I'm a dilettante. This was work on the side. I was writing books on Eastern Orthodox ethics at the same time. Seriously, right?
Yes, sir. I'm curious. Since you mentioned Buber and you spoke about Freddie the Pig, if by any chance you happen to come across the Three Little Wolves and the Big Bad Pig by Jesus,
No.
which is an
Inversion of.
of the other one, but which basically is full of wonderful moral applications. So
So I should read that.
Well, I mean,
Yes, I should read it. You recommended it, I'll read it.
you're a young man, and I thought you should read
I'm a
it.
young man. From his perspective, I'm a young man. My arthritis tells me differently, but it's getting harder and harder to garden. Yeah, I'm gonna have 5 acres. Ooh, good. Yes. Well, my students are coming over in 2 weeks, 10 of them. They'll labor all day from 8 till 8, and I'll feed them, and they'll be happy.
A comment and a question. I read The Tending of the Heart of Virtue as an undergraduate, decided to get married, have kids, so I can read them stories. Worked out perfectly. Now I have 2 kids. They are voracious readers of their own, and so it was with a certain Kierkegaardian fear and trembling that I approached your other book, Life's Living Towards Dying. It was a little scary.
Dedicated to my father-in-law.
Yeah, it was a brilliant, brilliant book. But my question is this. Since we are living in an age that has been, in a barbarian sense, so disenchanted, and we are living in a sort of after virtue, how do we bring back virtue into the entire discourse? Is this a lost cause? Is the cat out of the bag? I mean, is Miley Cyrus is going to take over the world?
She's a tragedy. She's a tragedy. We're seeing it played out right in front of our eyes, aren't we? And the people who promote her are just as guilty. And they do it every day. Even by taking notice of her. They shouldn't take notice of her. But you know, yeah, that's the world we live in, right? That's whose lives we're interested in. Not the lives of the saints, right? But People Magazine. And various TV channels in which their lives are reiterated for us over and over again. That is, the deities of a postmodern world, right? So, I think we're in a situation where the church is in a diaspora. I'm going to be morbid here. A diaspora such that it is still trapped in the body of a decaying and decayed Christendom. That's why I wrote a book called Ethics After Christendom. And we have a problem, but I don't think that public discourse will be leavened by trying to find a mediating language. We have to generate the language from within our faith, such that it's beautiful and attractive to people who are desperately seeking something that's beautiful. And I really believe that. It came home to me just the other day in my course on sex and creation and Christianity, where these young women who had been living with the feminists for 4 years of their college career suddenly discovered that there was a professor who actually challenged some of their premises and was offering them readings that they never imagined even existed. And on top of it, they realized already, they were prepared to come in my class. They knew they could have taken other classes. They realized already that what they'd been imbibing gave them the ability to vent, but it didn't make them happy. Show them beauty. Because what they're experiencing is ugliness. Ugliness in a world of male and female relations in which everything has become unraveled. And at the end of that class, after I had these women venting this, I mean a number of them, from different perspectives, as a heterogeneous class of 30, I limited it to 30 again. I said, okay, so are you telling me, all of you are telling me, there are 30 people in that class, but there are only 5 males. I said, are you telling me that it's all come unraveled and all of their heads went like this? Even the ones that were arguing against and with each other. So, there has to be witness. I'm a conversionist. I say convert, 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 where there's no purpose or meaning in the church. Yep. Yes?
But when were these halcyon times?
There were no halcyon times. There never were any halcyon
Well,
times.
So then where?
Remember, I
getting your-
teach theology. I teach historical theology. You don't think that there was halcyon times in the 4th century? There weren't any halcyon times.
Well, right.
Yeah,
So then where you? How can you critique this age?
Because I will argue that over a period of time, over centuries, the culture was changed. I can argue it through even the legislation that was promulgated by the emperors over 6 centuries, say, in the case of divorce. I can argue it in terms of how marriage became conceived in the Byzantine Empire from the 4th century through the 10th century. Yes, there was a difference. There was a Christendom. It wasn't Camelot. Yes.
Does putting oneself in the mental context of a story imply acceptance of its premises? For example, one can tell a story about a long-lost boy who suddenly becomes the cruel dictator of his own little country, and just turns out to be a nice guy at heart. Does that presume that you believe a person can be a cruel dictator and a good person? Does telling the story imply that you accept that?
Well, first of all, I think they can be, because there are lots of sociopaths walking around. But I'm not sure I understand your question. What is the premise? When we read a story, we obviously have to engage it in such a way that we live in and through it.
But does telling the story imply that we accept the premise?
Who telling the story? The storyteller or me telling the story?
Okay, anybody reading the story?
No, you don't have to accept the premise of the story. No, I don't know what you mean by premise. I don't think any story has here's one of the worst mistakes you can make in teaching literature. Identify the main theme in a story. If you can identify the main theme in a story, then there's no need to tell a story. Period. So I don't know that there's a premise to a story unless it's a bad story.
We've got time for one more question.
Story is about the engagement of human will and a drama that's being played out. It's not if there's a premise, it's that. It's about our humanity. And that's very broad. But beyond that, I don't think the stories have premises or main themes.
Okay, got a last question over here.
Thank you very much. As a headmaster of a school and the father of 5 children, one of my greatest fears, and I think one of the greatest dangers for our children, is the Susan in Narnia effect. So,
that Susan gets left out?
That Susan grows up. And forgets.
She gets left out of the kingdom.
Yep, and she gets left out of the kingdom because, so we start working with 7th graders, and they're in the process of finding a lot of these childhood stories. They want to put them behind themselves. And they're not quite ready to, I think C.S. Lewis describes sort of that gap when they're afraid to be children. What do you do for the 13, 14-year-old boy or girl who is just attracted to the world? What do you do? Are there stories? Do you have any advice for parents or teachers to combat that?
So-called adolescent literature. Well, C.S. Lewis also said you shouldn't write for age groups either. So the first thing is don't go looking for adolescent literature, because adolescent literature will have a premise. Not just one story, they all have a premise. The premise upon which they were written, which is not necessarily the story, okay? Honestly, I can't answer all of these questions. Remember, I'm not teaching primary or secondary education. I'm teaching in college, and I'm writing books on Eastern Orthodoxy, and I'm writing books on gardening, and I'm writing books on children's literature, and I'm confused. I'm not worried on children's literature. Honestly, I'm not. Now, I have some opinions. You've heard them. I don't, Look, I think there's a diagnosis there, a sort of pathology of adolescence that we've created. We've inflicted on our children. There's no need for that. I can understand the struggle for autonomy and freedom to a certain extent, although not to the extent to which we have in this culture, in which autonomy is held up to be the highest good. So that we as parents we're raising our children to be autonomous. No parent really wants that, per se. We should respect their freedom, but we want them with us through the rest of life. And in fact, after this life, that's what we really want. So to be sold on the notion that our responsibility is to make them autonomous, but that's part of the pathology. So we've created adolescence in this culture, in some sense. I don't know that my grandparents ever had an adolescence, like we know an adolescence. Maybe they didn't have the opportunity to be adolescents. But when I did oral histories of my great aunts and uncles, I don't think they had adolescence. Of course, they had a problem, too. They were in the middle of a genocide, and they were pushing dead bodies down the Euphrates, literally. And the Euphrates was red, okay? So maybe that's different. Maybe that's different. Or watching the Black Sea turn white, not because bodies are being thrown out of boats, turn white. I don't know how I got onto that, except that it's deeply inside of me. All right, but it's related to how I react to this also, because I think that you have a problem there. They should be able to. You should be able to give them great literature, and they should be able to consume it. Why can't they read the Odyssey at 13? What is it that's missing in the Odyssey that they need? Most of what they need is in the Odyssey. So read it. Why can't they read the Divine Comedy at the age of 14? They can. That question about inner city, that group that's down in Arizona, they go on mission into the Mexican areas, the Hispanic areas, because they don't know that there's a value in the education that they're offering those people. But some of their most successful schools are in those bilingual areas. It can be done. It's so frustrating. I'm not educating at your level. I'm telling you it can be done. Absolutely can be done. Content. Throw out the lesson books. In some of my classes, I don't make them to take notes except in the books they're reading. Try that.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Dr. Ryan, for being here. So now I get to announce the winners of tonight's book giveaway. So the first one is the book that covers some of the material that we covered tonight, Tending the Heart of Virtue, and that goes to Emily Johnson. Where's Emily Johnson? I'll just bring it down. Okay. Unfortunately, there's no runner-up to give it to. Let's see. The next book is The Fragrance of God, and that goes to Jennifer Jacobs. Jennifer Jacobs. Oh. And finally, Inheriting Paradise Meditations on Gardening goes to Jim and Caroline Stauff. Okay, perfect. Welcome. So that concludes tonight's program. Before we wrap things up, I want to mention a couple of upcoming lectures that are coming up. I will invite Dr. Stavru one more time to talk about the upcoming Cunningham lecture.
Thank you. I'm very glad that you are giving me this opportunity because I too want, in a personal way, to thank Professor Guroian for his presentation and for engaging us in the way he did. I know how tough it is when you are organizing lectures. The people who invite speakers, they pray that there will be good speakers. The people who introduce them, they pray that they will not be proven liars. I am very pleased that he bailed us all out very nicely. And I remember I said, from the little things that I knew about him, I said that he draws on the scriptures, he draws on the church fathers, he draws on contemporary thinkers and theologians. And I was listening to his presentation and praying, please bring an Orthodox theologian, please bring that. And he did all that. But anyway, thank you very much. But I now would like to tell you that a year before we started the Homer lectures, we started a special lecture series at the University of Minnesota called the James Cunningham Lecture on Eastern Orthodox history and culture. And they are always on the first Friday of November. Always on the first Friday of November. So this first Friday of November, we are having the 19th James Cunningham Lecture. Our speaker is Vera Shevzov from Smith College, a professor of religion at Smith College. Old friend. And she will speak on the Romanov family and the proliferation and their attitude toward icons. And he spoke about icons and idols. Right? We're talking about the icons now, not the idols. Anyway, about the icons of Mary and Mariology during the reign of Nicholas II. And we are doing it in connection with the Romanov exhibit that's going to take place at the Museum of Russian Art. So I am announcing it, and I would like to invite you. We usually have about 250, 300 people attending this event, but I'm sure we can make room for you, and there will be a reception afterwards. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to announce it to your audience.
The other lecture that I'd like to mention is one of the McLaurin CSF lectures that we have coming up. It is Dr. Michael Naughton from the University of St. Thomas, and it is entitled Beyond Career to Calling, the Vocation of a Business Leader. You can pick up a flyer on your way out, which has more information about that. That's on October 30th. And then finally, I'd like to invite you over to our study center immediately after. We're going to have dessert available. There'll be a chance to meet other people in the McLaurin CSF community, continue talking about tonight's lecture. To get to our study center, you'll need to go out the main doors of the student center, take a right, so you'll be going west about a block over to Cleveland, and then you'll go just 2 blocks south on Cleveland. The address is 1337 Cleveland Avenue. We'll have dessert. It'll be a good time to just continue the conversation. So thank you for coming tonight.